In this lecture, we consider the term genealogies. This week, we will explore the following three questions. What are genealogies? How were they recorded or transmitted? And what purposes do they serve? So far, we have considered examples from Fiji. So today, let's look at some examples from Tonga and Samoa. What are genealogies? I've derived some of these notes from Brigham Young University in Hawaii. If we look at a dictionary definition of genealogies, it refers to a line of descent traced continuously from an ancestor. Makes sense and seems pretty straightforward, right? Well, in actual fact, genealogies can be quite complicated. Originally, Pacific Islanders were identified by only one name, a given name, and that name might have been descriptive. That name may have been derived from a particular event or a particular object in nature, or it may have been named after someone else who shared the same name. It was only when Europeans arrived that Pacific Islanders began adding surnames. And surnames allow us to better distinguish between different peoples. So it's no surprise that Europeans, when they first arrived and attempted to document some genealogies of Pacific Island peoples, found it very difficult to make sense of these complex ancestral connections. Another reason why genealogies were more complicated in the Pacific was that languages in the Pacific Islands were not written until the mid-19th century. As a result, spelling was not standardized. And if you look closely at missionary records or the records of explorers or traders who visited the islands, you'll notice that they may spell island names or people's names very differently. For example, the island name for Fiji was spelt a number of different ways by different people. And so it's no wonder that if Europeans could not agree upon a spelling for a group of islands, when it came to genealogical records, it was also very difficult and inconsistent. And so we may see the same name of a person or individual appearing differently in historical and genealogical records. A third complication when looking at Pacific genealogies is that they do not always indicate the gender of a person. What is the word for genealogy in your own language? I'd be interested to hear in the tutorial discussion how your Pacific people express the idea of genealogies in their own indigenous languages. Let's look at a couple of examples of how genealogies might be represented. The most common form is through oral forms, by talking or speaking these genealogies through songs, chants, or stories. But if we look for Western scholarship about genealogies, we'll see a lot of graphical or documentary ways of representing them. In Aotearoa, the Maori term for genealogy is whakapapa. And here's an article in a journal called Genealogy, which gives a brief history of whakapapa, or Maori approaches to genealogy. So we can see here what might look like a family tree. The idea is of a family tree is that the oldest ancestor is listed at the top, and the most recent or the youngest of that family is listed at the bottom. In some cases, you might see different symbols being used in family trees, symbols to denote gender, whether a person is male or female, symbols to denote whether relatives are related as brothers or sisters, or whether they are married. You might see how this gets confusing if one individual has more than one partner and has multiple children to multiple partners. So it can get quite complicated. It can also get complicated if the spelling of names is different or if two people in the same genealogy share the same name. Do you have a practice in your own islands where children might be named after their parents or grandparents or even older ancestors? Imagine you are a historian looking back at your family history. How will you tell the difference between two people in your family who have the same name but were born in very different times? Here's another genealogy, and this one's by Percy Smith, an anthropologist from New Zealand, and it's published in one of those two journals I've already highlighted to our class that are key in this course, and that's the Journal of the Polynesian Society. The title of this article tells us a little bit about what the source of this genealogy is. It says, "The genealogy of the Pomare family of Tahiti from the papers of Reverend J. M. Osmond." So it's likely this journal article reprints some of the notes by Reverend Osmond, who likely visited Tahiti and tried to record the genealogies of a very high-ranking chiefly family in Tahiti, known as the Pomares. Here you can see a different representation. In the left-hand image, the oldest ancestor is listed with the number 1 at the top, Uru, and if you follow down, he traces that through multiple generations. If we go over to the following image, right at the bottom, we can trace it all the way till the 35th generation. You can see at the very beginning of this family tree, there's very limited details about who these early ancestors were. However, by the 32nd generation, Pomare I is listed, and we can see that Reverend Osmond is able to add some dates about when people were born or died. So this is another challenge with genealogy. We might be able to tell by comparing sources and stories what dates people were born or died, as far back as the 18 or even 1700s. But stretching back further into the Pacific past might become less clear, as Pacific Islands societies did not necessarily keep a dating system in the same way that Western Europeans did. That's not to say that the Pacific Island societies did not have clever ways of maintaining their genealogies. It's just that that Western Gregorian system of dating was not shared. The next question we consider is, how are genealogies recorded or transmitted? This is a fairly straightforward one, and it resembles the same way in which oral traditions or myths are transmitted and recorded. Pacific Island societies did this through memorized chants, dances, songs, legends, and pictorial design. You might think of your own examples from your communities in which families or communities have particular dances or songs which they use to remember ancestors. You might think of a myth or a legend which describes a founding ancestor, perhaps a single person who discovered your islands or who created your islands. that person may be connected to a chiefly family within your societies, or it might be connected to a god. There are many legends and myths about gods and demigods within Pacific societies, and some of these connect those deities to existing genealogies. Here you can click on this YouTube link for a more recent example of two gentlemen talking about Tongan legends on a podcast. In this episode, they talk about Talatupua, a Tongan creation story, and in it they describe the first Tui Tonga, or paramount chief of Tonga, who was named HY202, who started a royal dynasty around 900 AD. According to Tongan legends, he was said to have been the son of the god Tangaloa and a Tongan woman. And today many of the Tongan royal family line trace their lineage to him. Here we can see that the Tongan royal family, by connecting themselves to this origin story and to a Tongan god Tangaloa, is a key feature of their mana, their power or their authority. And it also tells us a little bit about how genealogies might be remembered. As we discussed in previous classes, you might notice some words being repeated in other Pacific Island societies. So far we've discussed Hawaiki and Burotu. Tangaloa is another one, a mythical god or deity that appears in a number of different creation myths throughout Polynesia. So the existence of this myth in Tonga tells us that the Tongans were most likely connected to other Polynesian islands in ancient history. Apart from these oral means in which stories were passed down through generations and continue to be passed down by elders or those gifted with orator skills, some of you might know of particular orator chiefs or orator clans within your societies that were gifted with this important knowledge and skill. But once Europeans arrived, there was a new form of recording and transmitting genealogies. This was done principally by missionaries who wrote them down, printed and replicated them. Today, we rely on church records, including records of baptisms, births, deaths and conversions, as a way of tracing particular people within family lines. If you look on the Moodle page, you will see a particular example in the assignment section from Rarotonga, which contains a full genealogy about Rarotonga in the Indigenous language, which is then translated into English. And that might give you a sense of both the possibilities of recording and transmitting oral traditions into other languages like English, but also the challenges in trying to accurately capture an oral tradition whilst recording it in a way that was not initially intended. We'll continue this video in the next section.